Hey guys, welcome to my 10.2.5, I guess by now, Fire Mage guide. It's not really a guide, so to speak, but more of like an info compendium. Um, this video is obviously very late relative to the patch cycle, so I'm not gonna be, you know, restating like some super obvious stuff, but just sharing my thoughts on the spec and yeah, things like that. I'm gonna break this into three parts. Part one, which is this one, we'll be talking about like talents and some of the key concepts and like super basic rotation stuff. Um, part two will cover like more in-depth rotation, and then part three will be like a video analysis of myself, just talking about what's going on in the moment as I'm playing on a dummy. Okay, so right off the bat, talking about talents first. Uh, our core tree is pretty much set in stone in terms of like two builds. The common build, which is the one that you'll find on Simcraft, is this one here, where you're basically just running like a pretty normal build compared to what we've been running in the past. The main difference is Flame Accelerant and dropping Alexstras's Fury. So a note on this is that Control Destruction is basically a passive. You'll just play it. It's extra good when it comes to fights where you lust on pull, or there is like some reason that you know uh, you'll spend time above 70 or below 30. So if it's like a an extended execute fight or you need damage specifically below 30%, then yeah. Um, but as an alternative to control destruction, you can also play Inflame. This talent just increases your ignite damage, and this is really good for any fight where there's some kind of cleave going on. On pure single target, Inflame and control destruction are basically the same, but on cleave, obviously Inflame is going to gain some value there. Also, if you don't lust on pull, I personally like Inflame more just because you're going to be casting less pyros. But if you're lusting below 30%, then this can also be an option. But you got to be careful because with double lust below 30%, obviously it gets a little weird with scorching, but I'll talk about that later. But yeah, just know Inflame is also an option. They are identical DPS wise, so play what you want. I personally like Inflame a lot. So yeah. Outside of this though, there's the other build that I like to talk about, and this is like a favorite of mine. It's Alexstras's Fury instead of Inflamed or Controlled Destruction. So if you run the sim, you're gonna see Alexstras's Fury loses by about 1%, I believe, DPS wise. The thing is though, this is just purely based on my findings at least. Um, so the source is trust me, bro. But I find that Alexstras's Fury is a good amount better than any of these two. If you look at the APL, for Alexstras's Fury, there's definitely a good amount of mistakes in it. What I believe to be mistakes, at least, which I believe is what's causing the DPS loss on the sim. From my testing, Alexstras's Fury is equal to or slightly better than these two. Uh, Nothing crazy though. This playstyle with Alexstras's Fury is also a good amount harder than to play any of these two. These two make the spec significantly simpler. Alexstras's Fury, especially in combination with Flame Accelerant, makes the spec significantly harder. On that note, I'm going to segue into Flame Accelerant here. This spell or this talent is not one we've really played much in the past. So just if you have not played it, essentially, if you don't cast Fireball for 8 seconds, your next Fireball is faster and does a lot more damage. The a lot more damage actually makes Fireball hit slightly harder than a Pyro, so it's quite a potent hit. However, the common mistake that I see with this talent is you never should be changing like your priority of spell casting. Like if you want to cast a fireball, you should cast a fireball, right? You don't want to not cast a fireball to force a proc to happen. Now I'll cover this more in the next part with Alex's Fury kind of gives us some tools that can make exceptions to what I just said. But if you don't play Alex's Fury, if you play one of these two, for example, you basically treat this as a passive. When it's there, it's there. The majority of the time, you're going to be generating this buff during SKBs and then combusts. So sometimes you'll leave an SKB and combust and you'll have the buff. And sometimes you'll like leave an SKB and combust and you'll get the buff in 2 seconds, but you have to cast a fireball now. You just cast a fireball. It sounds weird, but any other alternative to not casting fireball usually results in a loss. There are some very, very minor exceptions to this, particularly to do with like just IB pyroing, but like I really don't recommend kind of diving that deep in or cooking that much. Just treat it as a passive. 99.999% of cases, you will just gain damage just treating this as a passive. So make your life simple and do that. For M plus or AoE, we play like some Ignite stuff. I'm not gonna talk about it too much to be honest, because frankly, I'm not really an M plus like Mage content creator. There are other people who are, already have guides on that stuff in terms of talents and all that. So yeah, if you want one of those, check out some other Mage content creators. But yeah, this is basically our single target stuff. As for core concepts and things to look out for when it comes to Mage, um, a really important thing when you're playing a class is to understand what your goals are when you're playing that class, right? Like what accomplishes damage. For Fire Mage specifically, this patch, our core damage and like the metric for whether you're doing good or not comes down to how many pyroblasts are you casting in combust. That is the main like metric that I look for when I look for whether someone's playing good or bad. So for example, if you're casting a lot of pyros but they're not in combust, then that's not good. If you're not casting pyros in general, obviously that's also not good. So the key thing that you want to keep track of when you're playing, like your cognitive load, should be actually your Fire Blast charges or your IB charges. Your IB charges is what basically is where your brain should be like making decisions like 90% of the gameplay, at least once you like understand the core basics of the spec. When it comes to somebody who's like somewhat experienced at the fight or at the spec, sorry, your IB management or your IB charge management is the main thing you're going to be looking at throughout an encounter. So make sure, you know, get that into your head that that is the main idea. The reason why this is the case is because simply you have a set amount of IB charges throughout any given fight or time period. IB is a guaranteed crit, and essentially it's a way to force pyros. So naturally, you want to force pyros when you're, in combustion because that's our power window. A lot of people will think, oh, but I'm gonna use my IB charges to get to my next SKB faster. Well, if you do that, then you'll enter SKB with no IB charges, and then your SKB will be weak. That's kind of the whole thing I was talking about earlier, where you're casting a lot of pyros, but they're not in combust. That is not desirable. It is more important to cast pyros in combust, especially since the number of IB charges you have in total in a fight is set in stone, right? Whether you spam your IBs in combust or out of combust, as long as you're not capping the charges, you're not going to be missing out on IBs. So, obviously, within a choice of the two, you will want them in combust because you have the extra benefit of having combust. So, if you're learning the spec, really, really focus on IB charge management, not overcapping your charges, and also not wasting your charges. I'll talk about this stuff in more detail in the next part, but just as kind of like a sneak peek about what your fundamental goals of this spec are. Last few things I want to mention really quickly are to do with the Lust talent. For those who are new to Mage, you can press Lust twice with this talent. So if you Lust once, I get Lusty buff, I get Lust buff, but my Lust is not on cooldown. So I can press it again, and I get a second Lust. 140% haste, very powerful. Um, Also, this means that every 5 minutes, or slightly lower because of shifting power, you'll actually be able to lust a single time by yourself. So make sure you think about these things. When you have this much haste, then you run into issues with your GCD as well, where the cast time of some abilities becomes lower than the global cooldown, which means that you might as well not cast those abilities for A, damage reasons, and B, for spell queuing reasons. Simply put, why cast a Scorch that is 0.6 seconds fast when I can cast a Fireball that's 0.8 seconds fast? The global cooldown allows me to cast 0.75 seconds, no matter how short the actual cast time is. So it just makes more sense to not cast Scorch during double lust. This is not. This is almost like a all-powerful rule. There are some exceptions if you're an execute and you're double lusting an execute, but that's kind of like the weird thing that we want to avoid ideally. But sometimes it happens. We'll talk about that in the next part. Um, some very basics. If you already know this stuff, feel free to skip to the next part. But things like combustion lets you cast it while you're already casting an ability, right? So obviously, when you want to combust, don't just press combust randomly. Make sure you're already casting something and then press it near the end, right? Just it gives you an extra ability in combust, which is always good. Yeah, and fire blast obviously castable while casting. Yeah. If you're not used to ice flows, I really, really recommend you get used to ice flows because being able to cast a pyro hardcast on the move for SKBs is insanely powerful. Make sure you are familiar with the ice flows bug as well, where you can refresh ice flows near the end of the cast to not consume a charge, even though you're actually using the charge. You'll have two. So as you can see here, I'll press it again and I have three, even though I cast an ability. Now I did cast Scorch, but if I did that with Fireball, it would have been the same thing again. You need to make sure that you're pressing Ice Flows at the end of the cast. That's the key. That's what the blue bar is. But yeah, that's Ice Flows. I think that's most of the stuff that I want to talk about on this part. So I'll see you in the next one. Peace.